Thank you. I'm especially grateful to the organizers of the conference for their somewhat loose construction of the notion of a work in progress to accommodate the paper I distributed. With only slight alterations, it is well on its way to appearing as part of a book of what I call dueling essays on constitutional originalism. That's the reason it says a debate up front. My co-author and antagonist in the exchange of principal essays and then replies is high-tech, as I've come to think of him now, Larry Solomon, the commentator here today. Without getting too far ahead of myself, I might note that the organizers' leeway in assigning meaning to the words work in progress shows how interpretation of words can turn out in all sorts of contexts to be a process different from what one starts out imagining and even hoping it will be. While I do not think of myself as an originalist, that is not because I disdain the importance of constitutional language or of the bearing of original historical material in interpreting the Constitution. Most importantly, I don't consider myself an originalist because I do not believe that those materials bring anything like the constraint that I've written here most originalists seem to find in the Constitution. We've uncovered a fair amount of difference of opinion about that in the sessions here. I'll return in any event to that point shortly. In addition, I do not believe that even when those originalist materials might seem to provide a clear answer to some constitutional question, they need not be treated as decisive if other compelling considerations are present. I've even heard self-styled originalists embrace that notion as well. Most importantly for me, there is the pull of judicial precedent, despite some of the skepticism that was expressed about it, which I consider to be very important on account of the desirability of a good measure of stability in constitutional law. And then I won't go into the complication of constitutional amendments, which also are often built on a past that originalists might deem to have been mistaken, or even failure to amend, which also seem to me to create serious complications for the process. In addition, there's action on the ground other than judicial precedent or constitutional amendment. I won't go into my favorite example that has to do with the Electoral College in order to be able to poke fun at Mike Paulson. So an example of action on the ground is that Virginia to this day sends 4 senators to the United States Senate. And I was very interested in Mike's insistence that you've got to stick with theory, because I cannot, for the life of me, match up his self-proclaimed theory of interpretation with his treatment of the constitutionality of West Virginia in a, I would say, otherwise quite wonderful paper. Of course, the originalist materials often do not provide clear answers to constitutional questions that may arise. Larry Solomon and some other originalists concede that there are large areas where originalism leaves many questions unresolved. Most obviously, this is where constitutional language is very general or vague, due process, equal protection, cruel and unusual, and the like. But I would say that there are lots of constitutional ambiguities as well. At least Larry seems to think that if one struggles hard enough with surface ambiguities by looking at them, quote, in context, one can resolve those ambiguities, come up with clear answers to what the language means. And for Solomon and lots of other originalists, this is a purely factual inquiry. Here is probably my most basic difference with the analytical framework that an awful lot of originalists employ. They have disdained the old emphasis on original intentions, though we've got differences obviously here too on this, in favor of original meaning, because they think that the latter can lead to nice, clear answers to factual questions about ambiguities without the messy necessity of choosing among the large number of original intenders for constitutional language. They typically work that trick by assigning meaning to ordinary, reasonable people around at the time the constitutional provisions were promulgated. But that just doesn't work. There were more of those people than there were authors or promulgators of constitutional language. Had they been consulted, those people might have coalesced around some understanding of what this or that piece of constitutional language meant, and we might be satisfied that there was or would have been such a consensus with evidence far short of, I'm not looking for a Gallup poll, far short of a Gallup poll. If we're comfortable with the evidence of such a consensus about meaning, then there could be factual answers to meaning questions, even in the case of arguably ambiguous language. But absent such a consensus, the trick can't be pulled off with, quote, ordinary reasonable people abstracted from the actual ones. As tort scholars have long taught us, reasonableness has a large normative dimension. When there's frail evidence of actual consensus, choice will be necessary, and the choice will be guided by normative considerations. Some originalists think this can be avoided by insisting that constitutional language was used with consummate care, with no superfluous usage or some such rules. But any such rule itself represents a normative judgment, not a fact of the world. And there are lots of other normative choices that must be made in interpreting legal materials that can't be shooed away by invoking all those ordinary folks originally out there as the grounding for meaning. Ordinary folks would likely shake their heads in bewilderment when asked to resolve all kinds of ambiguities in the complex document that is our Constitution. And once one appreciates the relevance of normative choices in a great deal of interpretation, constitutional ambiguities are quite likely to proliferate rather than disappear. So, for instance, claiming the mantle of originalism, Justice Scalia opines that the speech and press protections of the First Amendment are not limited to spoken and printed communications, but are rather to be interpreted expansively to accomplish the broad purposes of those protections. One way to think about that perfectly sensible move is that the interpreter is to imagine that the fathomer of meaning back then was informed about the possibility of technological developments expanding the means of communication beyond those made explicit in the constitutional text, but you can't make that move in the name of either intention or meaning without importing some normative vision of what the point of the protection is. If I thought of myself as an originalist, I would actually prefer original intentions as probative rather than original meaning. But I don't think that that much guidance can be gleaned from original intentions either, or what originalists who disdain this material are more likely to call original applications. For those intentions are embedded in historical contexts which over time can, and quite often do, change in normatively relevant ways, so that there is no telling if an original intender were alive today would give the same answer to a question that bears surface similarity to one he did answer back then. School segregation in the 1860s just ain't the same problem that it was in the 1950s. This does not mean that original intentions about relatively concrete phenomena can't be helpful. They can be, just as judicial precedents can be in puzzling about issues that bear some similarity to new issues that arise. If the 14th Amendment protections were passed with former slaves in mind and specific abuses of them embodied in black codes, do those applications bear on questions of official discrimination against Chinese Americans? The original applications might not be decisive, but they could nonetheless be instructive as the interpretational enterprise proceeds. For these and a few other reasons, I see constitutional interpretation almost inevitably requiring the large-scale importation of contemporary values over time. It is itself a process in which the identity of the decision-makers, the judges, bears importantly on the substance of the decisions over time. This is not just realism about conduct that could be painted as illegitimate. It is realism about the only way the process could proceed once wide-ranging judicial review in the name of our Constitution is accepted.